as I was saying, I'm Devon. How's everyone doing? Good? Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm pretty new to the Netherlands. And yeah, I've been here about 6 months and I'm running this startup. And have a background in creative media, but we're getting more into experiential design. And our main medium is the use of sound in experiential design. But I'm not really going to talk much about my company today, to be honest. I'm going to talk about silence. I'm just going to tell a few stories and say a few things about silence. Seems straightforward enough, I guess, to talk about something that's kind of nothing, I guess, right? The absence of something. So what should I even say about that? So I'm a person that, in particular, I'm interested in sounds. And in a professional and creative capacity, I'm sometimes referred to as a sound designer, sometimes a musician, sometimes a composer, and amongst other things, in different situations, various things. So you might kind of wonder, why would you ask a person that's a sound enthusiast to talk about the absence of that thing they're enthusiastic about? So I'll get to all that. But a little bit background on me, further back. So I grew up in Los Angeles, California. More precisely, I grew up in Long Beach, which is the port city of Los Angeles. And it's also where Snoop Dogg, Nicolas Cage, and McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company all come from. And so, yeah, Long Beach probably fits most Europeans' very stereotypical idea what they imagine the California lifestyle to be. I mean, particularly off of this picture. But you imagine, it's called Long Beach, endless coastline, sunshine. Right, exactly, right. But it's all a facade. Long Beach is more typically looks kind of like that. It's probably the dirtiest beach in all of Southern California. There's actually not any waves even, because in the 1960s they built this giant jetty about a couple miles out that covers the entire coastline, so you can't even go surfing or do any of the other things that people usually do at Southern California beaches. Yeah, it's a bit of a joke. It's pretty much just your typical working class South Los Angeles urban environment. Yeah. When I was 12 years old, I was pretty much an outcast, kind of dejected, didn't have a lot of friends, and it wasn't until I discovered punk rock that I actually kind of broke out of my shell and felt like I found a community that I felt good to be a part of. And it's also where I began my first foray with my own creative expression, and that was by learning to play music. Right? It's probably one of the most democratic settings that anyone could pick up an instrument and try to learn how to play. Right? Because anyone can join a punk band pretty much and learn 3 chords on a guitar and you're good to go. Here's a power chord, just move that anywhere, it works. Yeah, it actually occurred to me this morning, the first band I was ever in was actually called Product of Silence, oddly enough. So yeah, we shouted a lot about social injustices and animal rights, and we took ourselves very seriously. I put out my first record when I was 16 years old. And I took the whole DIY ethos of punk very seriously. And I still do in a lot of ways. That's pretty much how I operate and how I run Stilted Collective now. But as my musical abilities advanced and my ears as well kind of matured, my musical interests sort of expanded, got into other genres of music, and I became a very dedicated fan of extreme metal music. So taking the experience coming from punk and coming into metal was an interesting experience, because I remember the very first time I ever played a metal gig. It was typical at a punk show, every time you finish a song or at the end of your set, people always clap or they give some kind of emotional response and appreciation to what it is that you've done. But the first time I played a metal gig, we finished and it was just dead silent. Everybody was just looking back at us and we were looking at them. And we were waiting for something that never came. And so we kind of were like, well, we either were terrible or we were so amazing they just didn't know how to react. And I know we weren't terrible, so. But anyways, yeah, so from there I ended up, I started my own record label with a friend of mine. And so this is a story about silence in a different sort of conceptual way, I guess. This record label wasn't a traditional record label in any way, in the fact that every album that we released was just my friend and myself making up different bands, recording an album, and then putting it out there. And the albums, the bands would have no names, the albums would have no names. It wouldn't say who made the albums. We actually, in correspondence with people, with customers and stuff, we would just, I was always referred to as Y, the letter Y, and my friend was the letter A. And somehow for about 3.5 years, we put out 16 records, just the two of us, and we sold thousands and thousands of cassette tapes and vinyl and merchandise like shirts and stuff like all over the world. So without ever even, I think the only advertisement we technically ever did was we said the very first time we released our first 2 albums, which were both cassette tapes again, we went on some underground metal forum and just made a post and said, new record label, label's called Rhinoceros, that had a name. 2 albums, unknown bands, no names. And it kind of just took off from there. After that, every time we put out a new album, people would do all the marketing for us, essentially. So there's something, I guess, intriguing in the mystique of not explaining things, being silent. Silent marketing, it works in some regards. Okay. But let's backtrack a bit further. Before I was 12 and discovered punk and everything, I was raised by my mother, who was a professor of medieval history. And one of her courses that she taught at the university, she would regularly take her students on field trips to a monastery, a Catholic monastery, out in the high desert of Los Angeles. This is probably, people don't usually think about ancient Christian monastic orders when they think about Los Angeles. But yeah, about an hour southeast of Los Angeles in a place called Valiermo, which is, it looks like something out of Tuscany, actually. It's sort of like this arid yet grassy rolling hills. And near this little town of about 400 people, there is a Benedictine monastery up on a hill. Yeah, anyway, so this is what the landscape in Valiermo sort of looks like. Oh, sorry. And yeah, this is part of the monastery. So we would go there a couple times a year and spend our time with the monks, walking around the monastery, walking through the hills, doing the Stations of the Cross. And there was this one spot in particular. Sorry, this is a terrible photo, but I couldn't find anything better on the internet. And there aren't any photos, for whatever reason, inside this collection of trees. But so on the monastery grounds, they had this sort of meditation or contemplation garden, prayer garden, I guess you could call it, which the monks there sort of used like a cloister. You know, they'd walk around in silence and contemplation and pray. It was beautiful. I mean, they imported all these trees from, I think, parts of Italy and stuff. So you just had this collection sort of in the middle of the desert. So anyways, the reason I bring up this story about the monastery is because, you know, silence is obviously a pretty fundamental aspect of the monastic lifestyle. And one of my earliest memories really giving kind of heavy contemplation to the idea of silence was during my trips to this monastery. And but this one time in particular, what was the normal routine when we would make our visits to the monastery is that we would show up about midday, stay the afternoon, go to Vespers and some various other activities, and then we would have dinner with the monks. So they had this massive stone dining hall, very cavernous, very acoustically reactive, I would say. And this one time, though, it was actually, this wasn't always the case, but this one time we stayed for dinner, they actually, it was one of the nights of the week or the month or whatever it was, where they were not supposed to speak during the meal. It was supposed to be a silent meal. Okay, well, they had all these college student guests, and I was there with my mother, you know, little kid. And the process, the order of things at this dinner was actually that you had this long table, basically like a buffet. You know, people would line up, they'd grab their plate at one end, go along, collect all the items of food that they wanted to eat, and then come back to their seats and sit down. But during this entire time, I mean, no one was saying a single thing, not a single word. But I remember thinking like how incredibly noisy the whole thing was actually, considering it's supposed to be a silent meal. Because without the chatter of voices or laughter to kind of hide the activity of eating, you know, and so, I mean, you have this like clinging and clanging of cutlery. You know, every time somebody took a fork to cut through their potato, you have this sharp like when it hits the plate, or, you know, people picking up their glasses and mugs and then setting them down on the cloth that kind of mutes the sound as it hits the wooden table below, like the thud, you know, and then, you know, hot soup, kind of people slurping. Yeah. So it was incredibly noisy, actually. And I remember then thinking about this as I went home, and I was like, well, like, that wasn't very silent, but like, how would you even go about having a completely silent meal? Or how would you go about having completely silent anything? How do you actually even find silence in its absolute sense, you know? Does it, I mean, so yeah, it leads to the question of what is silence exactly? Because it seems pretty unobtainable in a lot of ways. I mean, I remember trying to like, if you close your ears with your hands, your fingers, or from any body part, inevitably, okay, you maybe block out the sounds from the outside, but I mean, you're going to hear the blood flowing through your fingertips, or like, you know, wherever the skin contacts your eardrum. Everything becomes a conduit for kind of resonating sound. If you put in earplugs, I mean, it's the same thing. There's no earplugs that cut out everything entirely. So what is silence? It's really just seems to be sort of this lie. You know, it's a concept of some sort that people often aspire to obtain, but it's pretty futile, and it's, I mean, it's a pretty loaded word too. There's all these sort of class politics involved in this concept of silence or seeking silence as well. You know, people that are a little bit higher up in the order of things, you know, they tend to have an easier access to at least quieter spaces, or the pursuit of silence in a sense. Whereas people that are, lower down, they tend to live in noisy urban areas, and it's not quite as attainable to them, or the thought of it is maybe even, unrealistic. So, does silence even exist? Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm getting to the point. I don't think silence exists. And silence is so unnatural, actually, to humans. I mean, if you think about any sci-fi film or any film that takes place in space, right? And the one place where actually sound doesn't travel, we still can't make a film that's just completely silent in any like space battle scene, right? There's always laser beams shooting off and like thrusters and, or we need to hide it with music or something, You can't just have a film that's completely dead silent. Well, because then you notice people in the audience coughing probably while they're watching the film, So that would be, you get distracted from the film. So, it doesn't really work conceptually or like functionally for watching a film even. So, what was I going to say? Yeah. So after years of like playing loud, obnoxious music and contemplating all these things about silence and whatnot, I screwed up my ears so much. I have tinnitus now. So even when I'm in a very, very quiet place, I just hear ringing in my ears, especially my left ear, and it's quite annoying. So even if I were to somehow find an actual physical space that was completely silent, I'd still have the tinnitus in my ears. But even if I didn't have the tinnitus, I guess, how many people here are familiar with John Cage? Yeah? So John Cage, he's arguably one of the most important composers and music theorists of the 20th century. And he was very much interested in these ideas of silence, like what is it exactly? So he did these sort of experiments. He made a lot of trips to an anechoic chamber. Is anyone familiar with what an anechoic chamber is? So basically an anechoic chamber is a room that's been acoustically fitted so that absolutely no sound comes in, absolutely no sound goes out, and no sound travels within the space. It doesn't reflect any of the sound waves. So as soon as you speak, it just dies there. It doesn't go straight to the wall, absorb, gone. And so it's the only place, or these sort of places are really the only places on Earth where you can actually try to find complete silence. But then what he noticed when John Cage first went to these anechoic chambers, what he realized is that actually even in these spaces, it was so quiet that he would hear his heartbeat, he would hear like his stomach growling, he would hear even like the blood flowing through his body, like it was all he was much more aware of like the sounds of his own body. So even there he couldn't find absolute silence. Yeah, that's John Cage. Oh, darn it. I had a quote. And that looks like I lost it. Sorry. Well, anyways, it was something to the effect, this is something that John Cage said once, that, there's no such thing as an empty space or an empty time. No matter where you go or look, there's always something to see. And no matter how hard we try to seek a silence, like you'll never find it. There's always some kind of information, input, sound, So that inspired one of his most famous compositions ever. It's called 433. I don't know if anyone is familiar with 433. Okay. Yeah. So this is a performance of 433. So that was the end of the first movement. Yes. So now I go for the second movement. So I think you guys get the idea. I won't make you watch the whole thing. Although, I mean, so whatever, I can talk over it. What's interesting about it, though, so what John Cage was really getting at, though, was to sort of kind of problematize and reconceptualize exactly what silence means, right? And rather than thinking about it as the complete and absolute absence of sound, but maybe it's sort of a method to be a more active listener, right? So, I mean, unfortunately, I don't know how much louder I can get this, but what happens, basically the idea behind this piece is that all the sounds that the audience makes, all the sounds that happen in the auditorium or outside, anything that comes into the space within listening range of the audience, that becomes 433, right? Like that becomes the music. So it's different every time, right? Yeah, this video is particularly quiet, but what I listened to it earlier, and it's kind of interesting because in this particular auditorium, there's a lot of sounds from the street that you can hear actually of cars kind of passing by. So there's like every now and then you can tell there's like a truck that went by because there's like this low kind of frequency hum coming, you know, and then like higher pitched sounds, and like it sounds like maybe there was wet streets or something because it has that kind of slushy sound. And then every now and then someone kind of coughs in the audience, or somebody like, you know, gets up and goes to the bathroom. I don't know, hear them scuffling across. So that was the. So that was the. I mean, so that was really it for John Cage. Was like, let's think about silence in a different way, you know. And he always would say that his favorite moment or aspect of listening was actually moments of silence. But for him, yeah, like that wouldn't mean absolute silence in that sense, but he would talk about, you know, the sound of traffic in the streets, which he kind of considered that was the new sound of silence that was sort of taking over the globe, was the sounds of traffic. But it was always different in different places, you know, which he thought made it far more interesting than Mozart or Beethoven or something like that. Yeah, so. Oh, there's the quote. It was after, yeah. There is no such thing as an empty space or an empty time. There's always something to see, something to hear. In fact, try as we may to make a silence, we cannot. Yeah, so taking from John Cage, so years later, after all the crazy record label stuff, I decided to kind of take my obsession with sound to another level and study it in an academic realm. I went to art school and decided I was going to explore this idea of silence or in new ways. And I came across this concept of Unsound, which is, so there's this cultural theorist and sound theorist, his name's Steve Goodman, and he wrote a book called Sonic Warfare, where he, well, amongst other things, he talks about these sort of more disturbing and kind of dark uses of sound as a weapon or as a means to kind of cause people harm or discomfort, actually. But he also came up with this concept which is called Unsound, which are sort of like all the potential sounds that are out there that we have yet to actually hear, or the ability to hear, maybe, right? But there's some things like this, like, there's certain sounds that animals make, like insects and things like that, which you'll see in nature documentaries. They somehow magically make audible. Often what's the case in those scenarios, because like there's no way that they're making these sounds within the range of our human hearing. And what they do is they sort of will take a recording of an animal, like say a beetle or something, and then they will sort of pitch correct it within the range of what we can actually hear. So what we get is some sort of approximation of maybe like the texture of the sound that they're making, but it's not actually ever in that frequency, right? Like, not in the real world. So that would be maybe one example of what an unsound being made audible, right? So as I started to do my master's thesis research, I came across that idea, and another interesting one that, that in medieval times, it was common held belief amongst the great minds of the time that that inside every human there was basically music waiting to come out, but it was just inaccessible because it was trapped inside the body. But the bodies were actually divine instruments, musical instruments even, actually. And they had a similar concept about the cosmos, right? Out in space, there was actually, this celestial, galactic score going on, but it was just unattainable to humans on Earth. So I thought this was a really fascinating idea, though, as a concept for the work that I was interested in researching and pursuing. So what I got into basically was to create biofeedback generated music. I'll give you. This project is very. I called it the Addersis Chamber. Is anyone familiar with what Addercism is? So everyone knows The Exorcist. Exorcism is like expelling the demon, correct? So an Addercist or Addercism is actually the opposite. It's kind of assisting the longevity of the demon in the body of the host. So I made this thing. I called it the Addersis Chamber, but it appeals to all my kind of geeky, weird horror, sci-fi stuff. But it is more serious than that too, because it's about my identity as an Armenian American, as someone from the Armenian diaspora, and I always thought. I've always been very critical about the way Armenians sort of portray their identity to the world, because I find it a little sad, because so much of our identity tends to be, as a community, tends to be based off of the genocide and these histories of immense tragedy, which I think that's a shame, because I think there's a lot more positive things we can talk about, So there's that history of the genocide, and then there's also this history of, we had in the actual nation state of Armenia, we've had a war with our neighboring country, Azerbaijan, since 1991, basically. There's a ceasefire, but there's never been an actual peace treaty or anything. So, and when you're in Armenia, sorry, this is kind of complex history, so sorry if I'm boring anyone with it. But in Armenia, though, because most Armenians are actually not from Armenia, they're kind of scattered across the globe, about 75% of Armenians worldwide. But so Armenians within the country of Armenians sort of have a different view and the way they identify themselves. But it's also based off of conflict, right? So on one hand, there's, again, the history of the genocide, but now it's this modern conflict with Azerbaijan. So in both cases, it's like so much energy in the Armenian community tends to be built around these really kind of heavy, violent histories and situations, you know? So I kind of was like, well, so what if there was a way we could kind of capture, if humans are actually these sort of musical instruments, you know, and we're kind of imbued, you know, with cultural elements in our society, and then, you know, there must be some influence on whatever that biological music is that exists inside of us, if we were to believe this. So I thought like this was an interesting concept for the biofeedback music. And I made a couple of these, I made a couple propaganda films, I guess you will. And I made people sit down and watch them, and then recorded their biofeedback information, particularly like EKG, like a, you know, pulse rate, galvanic skin response, which is like how much someone sweats and how much their pores open, and like respiration cadences and frequency. And I took that data and then built a little program that would use the numerical data from that recording as a score to generate music. And then I built the chamber, and which is sort of, it's based off of my experience being on the front line in between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I went into a bunker where like the troops were hanging out, looking at the enemy over yonder. So I sort of recreated that experience, but actually made it sort of like, you know, you're surrounded, you're looking out on both sides actually, because in a sense that's what the, I feel like the Armenian identity is sort of stuck in, is this juxtaposition. I mean, physically is an actual geographical location, but also mentally between these two violent histories and situations. And so as you go in the chamber, the propaganda film that I had created for surrounding the issue of the genocide is playing on this side, and the biofeedback information that was generated, the music that was generated from people watching that film, they hear it coming out from this way, and vice versa. The war with Azerbaijan and the biofeedback music that was generated from viewers of that is coming out in this way, and they just play simultaneously, and it's this big mess. I mean, here, I'll play. Yeah. So yeah, that was my attempt to make the inaudible audible, and yeah, there's still work to be done on it. It's sort of, I would say, beta form, but but yeah, it's not pretty, and that was the point, really. You know, like people think that this is it's not a pretty experience or identity to have all the time. You know, like to be stuck in this sort of situation.